Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. My name is Linda Koziol, and I'm the co-creator with Carol Koziol of this series and co-editor with Craig Chalquist of the Sierra Club Books anthology, Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature in Mind. Today, Carol Koziol, who's the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network that sponsors this series, and she's also the co-creator of Ecopsychology Voices, will interview Dr. Carolyn Finney.
Thank you, Linda. So, Carolyn Finney, PhD, is a self-described storyteller, author, and a cultural geographer. As a professor in geography at the University of Kentucky, she is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. Carolyn completed a BA and MA. Both of these degrees focused on gender and environmental issues in Kenya and Nepal, respectively. And her PhD focused on African Americans and environmental issues in the US. Her first book, which is here, Black Faces, White Spaces, reimagining the relationship of African Americans to the great outdoors, was released in 2014. Along with public speaking, writing, and consulting, she served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years until very recently when they collectively and very publicly resigned. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah, it's great to be here. I also want to sort of throw in there, and this might influence the way, part of the way that we have a conversation, is that, I went to school. This is a second career. I was an actor professionally for 11 years, but, I would say from the time I was 14 until I was in my early 30s that I pursued it. The other thing I come from the arts. And for me, it's really important because it's where I stand more often than not. The other important thing to say is that I recently resigned from my full-time position at the University of Kentucky. And I resigned from it largely because I'm challenged with the way academia, in terms of engaging me and engaging difference and diversity broadly, I often get recruited in, but then they want me to look and behave and show up and write and speak in a very particular way around this work. And I don't want to have that fight anymore, but it doesn't mean I don't want to work with people in academia. So while I've got some financial anxieties around making this choice, this is part of what I talk about. So as of June 30th, I'm stepping out. I've stepped out already, but officially. So I think that's also an important part of this conversation too.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that piece. And it kind of brings me to my first question. When we met at Pacifica Graduate Institute, one of our first assignments that you challenged us with was to create our own personal environmental biography.
Yeah. And
this was a very profound experience for me as relates to who I be today. So yeah. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on the importance of positioning our relationship with and to the environment.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I love that exercise. And I loved what you wrote, I remember. So it's a couple of things for me. One is that I always tell people that, I'm such an accidental environmental person. Like I really, I'm not the person if you see me in person, I show up in the room and I'm like, fashion, and I'm an urban person by nature. And so while I've done a lot of backpacking and all of that, I actually would not be the person you would look at and think, oh, this person or her primary, work is related to the environment. So I came to this from a personal place. And I think all of us actually come to this from a personal place. We just may not think about that, right, as we move on in our professional lives in particular. And I talk about in the early 2000s when I was doing a PhD, I was actually still focused on looking at gender and conservation in Nepal. I lived in Nepal for a while. I loved Nepal. I'd gotten a Fulbright to be in Nepal. But as often happens with you go into PhD programs, you start taking all these other classes. And so I was getting all this other information was swirling around my head. But it wasn't even that influenced me. It was what was happening with my parents on the land that they were living. And that's where this research came from. My parents, and many of you may know this story. I talk about it very briefly in front of the book. But I always give this story wherever I go around the country to speak, is to say that, my parents cared for land for 50 years that wasn't theirs. They never owned it. A very wealthy Jewish family, 30 minutes outside of New York City, had a beautiful 12-acre estate, swimming pool, lake, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, gorgeous. And they needed caretakers, and they needed a chauffeur, and they needed a part-time housekeeper. And that's the job my parents did for 50 years. And if I had some images, really stunning in this very wealthy, all-white neighborhood, and very wealthy. Harry Winston of, Winston Jewelers had property down the street, Wingfoot Golf Club around the corner, Schaefer of Schaefer Beer next door. Significant financial wealth. And we were the only family of color in that neighborhood for many, many years until the 90s. Then a Japanese-American woman moved in, and then she moved out. So at that point, both Mr. Tishman had died, Mrs. Tishman was dying, and the concern was what happens to my parents who've been on this land for nearly 50 years caring for it, but they don't own it. The property was worth over $3 million in the 90s. So the property is worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone, $125,000 a year. My dad was making something like $20-something thousand a year, right? So they can't be on this land. And to Mrs. Tishman's credit, she wanted to make sure my parents had a home. So in the end, she had a home built for them in Leesburg, Virginia. My parents are originally from the state of Virginia. My youngest brother was married with kids and living there. I was moving around too much, and my other brother was moving around too much to keep up with us. And so they had a beautiful home built on a half an acre of land. At the time this was happening in the early 2000s that I got interested in race and environment and difference more broadly, I saw how hard it was for them to leave that land. The people who knew it better than anybody else, who worked on it more than anybody else. And I would argue, though this is subjective, loved it more than anybody else. And what I also had to come to terms with was my own feeling about that place as my home, right? It's actually way easier for me to talk about my parents and how they feel. And it's been very difficult since my parents left, because my dad has just been depressed and talks about missing that land. And now he's got early stage, Alzheimer's. And so, how things go in a loop when that happens around this conversation. And that's when I became personally interested in the idea of broadly race and environment, but the environmental autobiography. Like I believe all knowledge is subjective, which means that we bring all of who we are to bear upon anything it is that we're trying to understand. For me, it was really important to own that I have that. That means any bias that comes with that, any perspective, any feelings I have about it are largely embedded in my own lived experience with people that I care about, and my own experience on a piece of land that I have a personal experience that I can never return to, short of I win the lottery and then I can buy it, And I do have these dreams, but that's another story. So I, in part, came to it that way. I, in part, got the idea because someone named Mitch Tomashow, he had been teaching at, during that time, I think at Antioch, and it's been so long, but I went and met him, and he had written a book, talking about a lot of things having to do with the environment, and there was something in there that I remember triggered that he's even thinking about it. And so I just sort of took the idea and said, okay, here's why I think people can start from there. The other thing I want to say, it actually connects us. So, because I do all my work is embedded in the idea of difference and race more specifically, the first thing I always want to do is remind us all that we're human first, right? And so by telling a story, you can tell your story about your life. There's no right or wrong to anybody's story about your life and your experience of your life and on how it's impacted you. And it also then makes me vulnerable if I tell a little bit of that story, which opens up the possibility that you feel safe to be vulnerable too. And for me, it's about how all of our stories of who we are and show up are in relationship to each other. So if we then start to think about potential common intentions in terms of work, in this case around the environment or race that we might have, we can start from a more grounded place, literally. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yes. Head nods all over the place.
Okay.
So talk more about how issues of difference impact participation in decision-making processes designed to address environmental issues.
Well, the thing I guess I say, particularly here in the United States, but I would venture to guess it's true pretty much anywhere in the world, is that, in the United States, when we talk broadly and in the mainstream about the environment and the way that the movement's gotten shaped, even when you look back at, say, 1964, where we had two very important pieces of legislation in the same year. One was the Civil Rights Act, which, it was something I was aware of in my family because we were Black, and so we could think about that and understand that in a particular way. But the other in the same year was the Wilderness Act. And I never thought about the Wilderness Act. I never heard of the Wilderness Act till I got into graduate school. It just never crossed my mind as anything having anything to do with me, right? And when you look at the language in the two, and it's not to diminish the group of people who sat down and were very thoughtful about what they wrote in the Wilderness Act, they use very what I call universal language about how we should be universally able to engage and be in the woods and and all of that. That was happening during the time of Jim Crow here in the United States. So it didn't matter if you were talking about a building, a restaurant, a movie theater, or a grove of trees. If you were non-white, you could not engage in the same way. But what I found always to be true historically about the environmental movement, it didn't actually own that part of the conversation. There was always this feeling that because it's the trees and the woods and the mountains and the ocean, that somehow that was sort of immune from the larger conversation about difference. And of course, it is not, right? I tell stories about a wealthy Black family in Florida that they made a lot of money in the 40s. But in Florida, if you were Black, it didn't matter how much money you had, you couldn't go to the same beach as white people. So they bought a beach, which is still there, called American Beach. So it was, in part, the issue of difference, it stems from historically, at least in this country, to understand that if you are non-white, you were never starting from the same place as everyone else. And that includes land, right? So if we think about 1862, the Homestead Act, which was, now I understand, probably the most important piece of legislation ever, because it changed the way we relate to land in the United States. And you can't have a conversation about the environment without also talking about land. And so looking at how many European immigrants were allowed to get 160 acres of land free. And I'm not saying they didn't come from something hard, and I'm not saying it wasn't hard. They had to live on that land for 5 years. They had to farm. Many of them didn't make it. It's hard, isolating work. But, who was on that land before they got there, right? It was American Indians who had to be removed and often killed. Most African Americans of the time who were recently freed as slaves could not participate. So the issue of difference, there's so many ways to talk about it now, today, to understand those things didn't go away. It didn't go away at all. We're still having conversations about everything from the criminal justice system to issues of access, of security, and citizenship. So for me, when we're talking about the environment and land, we're also talking about the act of belonging. Citizenship is just, for me, a state-sanctioned way of saying you belong. It's also a way of telling you you don't belong. And being able to feel connected to a place, to the land, to that environment around it, to have that is a privilege that a lot of people in this country haven't historically been allowed to engage in, and a significant number today still can't. So one of the things every summer, my parents came from a small, even though I grew up in New York, I was born in New York. They grew up in a small town in Virginia called Floyd, Virginia. They grew up poor, high school education. And every summer, it was great. We would drive down for the summer because they both came from huge families, lots of cousins, so I had like my New York urban experience. And then I was down in Floyd, Virginia every summer. But then I hadn't gone for many, many years. We hadn't taken that family trip in many years. And about 5-6 years ago, we said, okay, we're going to do it. It's been a long time. We drove down. The first stop we made when we got into Floyd was that my father's family is all buried. They're buried in one spot, but not in a formal cemetery. It's on this land that used to be in their family, but isn't anymore. It belongs to a white farmer. And the image, we in order to go on the property, we had to ask permission of the farmer. Now, the farmer was on his tractor. He was a very nice man. He said, sure, come in. And if I could show you the picture is this wide expanse of land, the farmland. And in the middle, there's this old broken down wooden fence. and it's all overgrown inside, and it's where my father's family is all buried. So we're going close. We can't go inside because there's snakes and it hasn't been cared for. But the point that I want to make about belonging, and he's just one story. There's plenty of stories like that around the country. People who can't even go honor their loved ones who've passed away. That my father has to get permission as a grown man to go see his family on this land that he can't own, right? So it's complicated for me, the issue of difference. Why everything from issues of racial prejudice to economic, let's take it, you can take race out for just a second. We can look at economic issues, right? But often I get nervous saying that because in this country, people generally want to have the economic conversation because for me, it's easier to have that one than the racial one. And of course, we know intersectionality is there, but I don't want to take away from the fact that you have many white Americans who are poor and suffer as well. And that's real. That's real.
So this kind of leads me into the next question. In your bio sketch, you describe how you like to trouble our theoretical and methodological edges that shape knowledge production and determine whose knowledge counts. Okay. So considering indigenous nature-based communities, the work in Kenya and Nepal, what global learning can come from this edge work?
Well, wow. So one of the reasons I sort of added that phrase like about 2 years ago was my own frustration within academia in terms of what knowledge is privileged, right? I pushed up against it all the time. We talk about citationality. So, if you follow the sort of traditional academic path, and it's hard not to if you get into that engine because they want you to, they cite. It's all about who do you cite as being important. And largely what you end up citing are other academics with all the letters after their name. But those academics, in large part, get their knowledge from people on the ground whose stories they are privileged to gather and collect and learn from. And part of the problem I have with that is just who has ownership over that? It's like, so they just become a subject of the research and not actually the knowledge purveyors. Like their own lived experience is, for me, as important as book learning. And, and why can't we hold them? Why can't we hold them in the same, privilege them in the same way? Why can't we privilege, one of the things that people know I talk about, I was at Berkeley for 8 years. I had been recruited there, and there was a big public fight over my tenure for 3 years. I was in a very large department on environmental science, policy, and management, largely scientists, largely white, largely male. And it was 23 of them that just kept pushing back. They didn't like the way that I wrote this book. They didn't like the way that, what I had to say. And one of my favorite comments that they said on paper was, "We don't understand the value of you citing Zora Neale Hurston or Spike Lee in your work." Now I want to hold that there because I still get surprised every time I see that thing and say it out loud, because they were saying a couple of things there. So Zora Neale Hurston, if you don't know, well-known, she's an African-American woman, folklorist, anthropologist, and novelist, right? So their eyes are watching God. From nonfiction to fiction, brilliant, right? And Spike Lee, probably the best-known African-American director in the country, particularly telling stories about African-American lives. And when I was doing this book and my dissertation, I pulled on a wide variety of sources, including, why wouldn't I pull on either one of them? And I could make the argument that, there weren't many books on the library shelves about African Americans in the environment, which I do make that argument in the book, but also that there's all this other knowledge that was telling me a lot about African American culture, how we show up in place. So it told me, one, that yes, there were many scientists who privileged science over social science and the humanities. It told me more particularly in terms of racist attitudes, and if I'm kinder, biased, extreme bias, let me be kinder. I like to be kind when I can. But it also told me the level of arrogance. We don't see the value, so therefore it has none, which is the implication. So it comes back to troubling the edges of that, because when you work in spaces that are saying they want to be innovative, we want to be creative, we want to be innovative, we want to be part of change, innovation doesn't happen in a box. I'm sorry, unless somebody can correct me on that. It doesn't happen in a box. So I said to someone right after all that was happening, they said, this is terrible. This is happening to you. You should just take your toys and go play in another sandbox. And I said, I totally appreciate what you're saying, but I don't want to play in the sandbox. I want to play on the beach. And that, again, is the point of troubling that we've put these tight edges so there's no room for us to grow. So we're replicating and perpetuating the very thing we say we want to change. So then I'm always asking the question, if we really want change, what are we willing to risk? And what does that ask of us in terms of what we have to do? Because for me, it means stepping into what I like to call the I don't know. It's like, I don't know. It's like right now, I don't know anything. I just walked away from my job and I'm freaking out just a little bit. But I also know that it's like I have to be in the I don't know for something else to emerge. So the new, for me on the edges, it's where the possibility of emergence is the strongest. Often at the center, the problem is it's wrapped up with the status quo and it's difficult. I mean, I was both complicit and also corrupted because I'm also in it. I'm relying upon it for my paycheck and my well-being. All this stuff is mixed up in there, But if you're out on the edge, it's a little more expansive, right? You can breathe a little bit. The possibility of something else then has space to show up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that leads in my next question is what kinds of things need to change to allow for more emergence?
Well, revolution. Yes, in a word. And I mean that in all the best ways. I think, I'm trying to debate. I'm in a recent thing that's going on with an organization, but I don't know if I should be saying this because I realize this is taped and it may be that I shouldn't be saying this right now. So I'm going to hold on to that for a second as an example. But I think there needs to be, risk taking is real. What I can appreciate for myself and everyone, where most of us are sort of caught up in a life where we have to pay the bills and we have people relying upon us and we got to eat and all those things are real. And there's something about sort of taking stock of really what's real. And because the risk, there are people who've had no choice but have had to risk their entire lives just by showing up in the spaces who they are, whether it's so we can use the example today of people who are considered refugees as an example. And in this country today, that's huge. If your refugee status gets revealed, that you are not a citizen, you could lose everything. And the stories have just been, for me are just, I can't even get next to it. I realize my own privilege of having a passport so I can be here. So at the very least, you can't just automatically get rid of me in my life just like that. So risk is different for everyone. And some people live it on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not saying that they should be asked to do the same thing as others. But I think it's important, I know for myself and the rest of us, to take stock of what that risk asks of us. Because I think we have to give up some stuff. I just do. It may not be the same for everyone, but I just think we do. I don't foresee a way of being completely comfortable in order to have that innovative change. But I also like to think about how maybe it was 2 years ago, her name, Svetlana, I think it's Alexievich, she won the Nobel. I think so she's from Belarus and she'd written about Chernobyl. She really challenged her country. And she brought all that stuff like that they weren't doing right. And many in her country didn't like her for that and didn't even think she should have won for that. But she was on NPR and she was talking to Michelle Martin and she said something to the effect of, people want to be comfortable, but I love my country and I'm not interested in it being comfortable. I want it to be better. And so for me, in part of it, it's a reframing, these ideas of what is it really about comfort? Or is it about something else that actually asks something else? And at the bottom of all of this, if we are in better relationship with each other, then comfort then is not so much an issue because then we have the trust of our relationships. So one of the things I'm trying to understand at this moment where I walked away from this job is that My friends who are wiser than me are saying, but what you have, you may not have the same security financially, but you have the security of your relationships. And then what you have to trust is you're not going to like disappear, be homeless on the street. You're like, for 101 reasons, but you tend to your relationships, and that's what relationship is about. So as we all kind of move forward in what is an incredibly difficult time, particularly here in the US, I'm trying to think what that looks like in practice.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm hearing the relationship piece speaks to something near and dear to my heart, is that's community and
yes.
communal living. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are two different things that I heard there for me that are two different. Community and communal living are for me not the same thing, right? So community, I think, is one of those wonderfully broad terms that can sometimes get overused. But when I think of community, it can be a community in place, so we all live in the same neighborhood. Maybe we live in the same building or, same set of buildings. But it can also be a community of ideas. It could also mean that I don't live where you are, Carol, right? We don't live in the same place, but I could argue that maybe we are part of the same community of ideas, and ideas, I can support you, you can support me. We don't have to be living next door to have that kind of sense of relationship. And so that's in part how I think of those. I don't think we have to have communal living to achieve that. I think that's one way, that's one articulation of what it can mean to be in good relationship, but it's not the only one. And it's not even the primary one. I think part of leaning into difference is understanding that difference sometimes, there isn't a blanket thing you can apply and say in terms of difference. Like, so if we all do it this way, that allows difference to express itself, because it actually won't for everyone. That's the argument I would make.
Right. So I'm hearing diversity is an important component.
Difference. So I try very hard not to use the word diversity anymore, and I do it on purpose. Okay. Diversity for me, as someone who's been reached out to and considered diverse and gotten diversity scholarships, diversity for me came out of very particular, I think, a good intention, actually. Here in the United States, of seeing that we don't have, in terms of especially sort of gender, race, and ethnicity, those three types of difference. We don't have those three things evident. We're going to find a way to engage that. Excuse me. I think it's I think it's a good intended thing that's really surface. It's really Band-Aid, and actually, it doesn't get at all the other ways we are all different. So if we start talking about intersectionality, and most of us hold more than one kind of difference in our embodied experience, right? And we privilege that in different ways. So it just doesn't get at that. Also, this whole difference and inclusion, diversity and inclusion makes me, I try not to start twitching, because, I think about what happened with me at Berkeley, that my department was in the College of Natural Resources. That at the time had a $16 million endowment to do diversity and inclusion work. I was the only African-American in a department of 75. I taught the biggest class, was the lowest paid, brought in more African-American doctoral students than anyone in the history of the department. And so, the disconnect between the diversity and inclusion endowment and actually you've got somebody here on the ground doing the work, but you don't know how to support that. And that for me is just one example out of so many examples of this going on, and often with good people. So that's the other thing, it's not like, oh, these are bad, evil, racist people. Actually, more often than not, they're not. And that's the other thing to get at. I tell people, I think the hardest group of people for me to have this conversation with are people who consider themselves feminist, liberal, and progressive. And the reason is because I'm part of that group. And the reason is because we often think we're there. We're there. And we're doing the work. So we don't necessarily recognize the blinders we have. And we can stumble into things, with all of our good intentions intact. But we then don't attend to the consequence of our good intentions. Because that brings up everything from the fragility to the guilt to, all of it. Roll it on down the hill, right? Oh, I got off on I don't even know where I was going there.
Well, thank you for that clarity of difference and diversity.
Yes, thank you.
Different is now my vocabulary.
Yes.
Okay, so just kind of wrapping up then, what different things are up for you next? Because you had written a couple of things that your next projects are.
So in all of this is part of leaving too, right? Stepping out. So one of the things that I've always been trying to pull all this together, the arts background, the privilege I've had to kind of work in the academy and have a sense of how you approach a lot of these questions as research questions, the relationships I formed in the country and some outside as well of people, whether they're in academia or not doing this work, and getting back to also to where I show up the most, which is in the arts. And a lot of the ways that I work and present, whether it's poetry and other ways to get at some of these issues and move forward together collectively, I want to be able to do that more fully. In September, I got accepted into, in the Adirondacks, it's called the Blue Mountain Retreat Center. And they bring in a group of writers, activists, artists, and musicians. They bring in a group each month, like for the month of September, they'll bring in a group of us, maybe 12 to 15 one time, to be at this beautiful place on the lake and kind of have time together to work on independent projects. I haven't been able to do anything like that. Actually, I've never done anything like that. And I haven't had any time. I tell people that for the beautiful thing is the book came out and I didn't get tenure, but especially the last 2 years, I travel every single week. The invitations are already into next year. Like people want to have these conversations in multiple ways. And I love doing it. And I feel so privileged to do it. And I'm exhausted. And I have, I don't want to be repetitive, right? I got to find out what am I inspired by? How do I evolve? Like, what is there, so part of this is about creating space for me to find that way so I can show up more, what's the word? Not transparent, but also integrity, all the things that I say that I'm also doing, it's kind of put into practice. And so I know that's not what you were asking me, to be more specific. And yes, there's a new book that I've been knowing that I'm working on for 5 years and have had no time. People want me to tell more about that story of growing up on that land and the experience of my family being there. And I'm sort of linking that to ideas of Black identity and Black imagination. And, what I didn't say is I'm also adopted. When my parents thought they couldn't have kids, they adopted me. And then, like I always tell people, they relaxed and they had both my brothers after lots of relaxation. And so, my obsession with issues of identity is very personal as well, because I don't know that. And so I've been doing a lot of exploration around that and kind of pulling these things all together into, I'm going to call the next book, I don't know if you know the poet Nikki Finney. Nikki Finney, we're not related, though people always ask. She's a National Book Award-winning African-American poet. Her work is amazing. We were driving around. She was showing me around Kentucky a couple of years ago when I first came here. And we had this conversation about architects. And she said, architects, when they put up a building, they'll put a pathway. But because we're people, human beings, we don't always take the path. We create our own path. And she said, that's called a desire line. And the minute it flew out of her mouth, I said, that's the title of my next book, is Desire Lines, The Geography of a Black Imagination. So I have that. There's a piece that I wrote for something because I served on the National Parks Advisory Board. So John Muir had been in our conversation a lot about the relevancy of John Muir. And I sort of wrote something that I semi-performed, and I want to actually create a performance piece. What would a conversation between myself and John Muir look like? Because what John Muir represented, and I sat on the board, he wasn't imagining me on the National Parks Advisory Board. And there's something about, without diminishing his level of commitment and what he's contributed to a larger conversation about the environment, but also recognizing his, if you read some of his writings, he was racist. He had a very particular view of non-white humans, and, and that complexity, I think there's something to be gained from understanding that and owning that. And so I want to do something as a performance piece with myself and images, and what if we had a conversation, what that might reveal. And then there's just some poetry stuff I've been writing, that spoken word stuff I do at a lot of these talks, and I'm pulling that all together. And there's more. And I consult with groups. I'm consulting with a group in North Carolina, and I sit on a board for Orion Magazine. There's a lot of different groups of people. And finally, what I will say is that I'm trying to work right now with 4 different universities that say they want to bring me in. And I don't want the full-time job the way it's like, because that's what I'm walking away from. But I was like, can we create another way of thinking about it? Because lots of students want this. They want to think about activism. They want to think about art. They want to think about scholarly work. And they want to think about relevancy and change. And they want to be actively a part of that, and for it to be recognized, valued, and supported. So I'm really interested in having that conversation. And if I stand outside the academy, but still say, I want to be in a relationship with you. I know a lot of great people in here. But once I'm outside, I'm free. I'm free. They can't tell me what to do, which then opens up the possibility, that we can actually do something different together.
Wow, Carolyn, you are so inspiring, and we would love to watch you emerge.
Let's do it together.
Yes, yes. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for your time, and I'm going to stop her recording so we can talk with the audience. Thank you.
Yep.